Welcome to this new Christian year. As we begin with the season of Advent, as Father Cook mentioned, it's a time of preparation, and it's a minor penitential season. It is not as hardcore as Lent, but we're definitely not in a Christmas or Easter or even Epiphany mood. We're a little more self-reflective during Advent, and so to kick off the new year, I want to talk about sin. A tutorial on sin, and I'm sure you're so glad you woke up for this. But our readings actually play with this motif a bit. They play with the idea of darkness and light, and in the letter to the Romans, which is where I'm going to focus this morning, there is this great line: lay aside the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Darkness and light, laying aside the works of darkness. The majority of our time will be about kind of how we lay aside those works of darkness. But we're not going to get lost talking about big, bad, burly sins that make headlines and that get everyone all excited. So calm yourself. We're going to talk about little sins, little sins that kind of are habitual and kind of sneak up on us. So as we lay this out, I have to start with a little light example, a light little story. And before I do that, I just want to thank C.S. Lewis because he was kind of the inspiration for this little example that I'm going to take way too far and take it way out of context. So if you want to see the original, go and read some C.S. Lewis. Over Thanksgiving, I was up in Philadelphia at my parents' house for the week, and it was a wonderful week. Mom and Dad have a dog called Riley. She is an Australian cattle dog. She's 35 pounds. She's amber in color. She has a big bushy tail and some longer fur. Imagine what a fox looks like. That's what Riley looks like. Riley, we got as a used dog. We only get used dogs in the Groff house. We don't get them new. We got her after 2 or 3 years. And the reason we inherited her was because her family of origin was tired out. Australian cattle dogs are a very, very active and intelligent breed. In Australia, they're used to actually herd cows by nipping at the heels of the cattle in order to get them to go in the right direction. Well, Riley is true to her breed. She has a ton of energy. Even at 8 years old, she is still nipping at the heels of Nancy and Sandy Groff to get them to go into the kitchen and give her a treat. So I decided at the beginning of the week that I was going to try something new with Riley. I was going to give her a walk every day, and I was going to really see if that helped with this energy of this 8-year-old Riley. And so I put her on the leash. The leash is one of those plastic boxes that have 30 feet of leash inside of it and a little clicker button on the top that will yank the leash if you need to yank it at any moment. I like what I consider free-range walking, where you let the leash all the way out to its maximum length and let the dog kind of figure out where the dog wants to go. Well, right at the kind of end of my parents' driveway, there's this tree. It's a skinnier tree. And so on the first day that I took Riley out, I let her free-range it all the way 30 feet away from me. And we were walking out towards the street, and she was walking out towards the street 30 feet away. But as we approached the street, that tree came in the midst of us, in between us. And we were both moving at a nice clip, and the leash caught the tree, and I'm exponentially bigger than Riley, and so she got yanked back because of the force of the tree. I looked over, and I could tell she was very confused, because she looked back at me and looked at where we were going and thought, aren't we continuing to go this way? Why did you yank me back? But I hadn't yanked her back. It had been the tree that had yanked her back. And she tried to come over toward me, getting the cord even more wrapped around the tree. You've all been there if you've had dogs before, yes? So you have to backtrack, and you go back around, and you pull her, and get her back onto the right track. Well, I'm going to propose that this is kind of how sin works a little bit in our lives. We're going to kind of play with this imagery of the dog and the leash and the tree in order to understand how we, as the dog, we're the dog in the metaphor, God is the master, get kind of yanked back unexpectedly by the sin in our life. The sin can kind of come out of nowhere, and it can leave us confused. The consequences of it can kind of feel almost like we're getting pulled back, like like life is not quite the way we expected, even though we were heading in the same direction as God. Now, before we get into all of that, and we're gonna kind of take it a couple different angles, but I need to say this because I don't want you to get the wrong idea. If you don't remember anything from this sermon, I want you to remember this one thing about sin. God forgives you. God, through Jesus Christ, forgives you of your sin. That is the big story. The big story here is that God forgives you. No matter what your sin is, no matter what the problem is, no matter how it happened or why it happened, God in Christ gives you that forgiveness. And I experienced that with the dog. I wasn't really mad at Riley. She was just kind of being a dope, right? She just didn't understand how physics worked. And so I forgave Riley and we went along our business. But the next day, we came out again, and I did the same thing. Let the leash go as long as it could, and she kind of this time went out 30 feet initially, but very quickly she came back to about 5 or 7 feet away from me as we approached the tree, and she navigated around the tree. I was like, oh, she is intelligent after all. We can learn, but the big point here is that we are forgiven. But that's not what this sermon's about. But I had to say it because I want forgiveness to be lodged in your brain. Okay? We're good? Okay, good. We're awake. Great. Let's pretend for a second. Now we're in fantasy land. This didn't actually happen. Okay. We walk out this time with the lead, and she comes in 10 feet to avoid the tree. But this time, there's a squirrel. And the squirrel is heading in the opposite direction of us and the tree. The dog sees the squirrel. Of course, what's the dog going to do? The dog's going to take off after the squirrel 30 feet until it gets yanked back by the leash, going in the opposite direction of where we were intended to go. This happens to us in terms of our own sinfulness sometimes. We are individually tempted. And there are numerous kinds of temptations. We could categorize them in just a short list. We could talk about greed, or we could talk about lust. We could talk about pride. We could talk about power. All those trappings that kind of catch us up individually as we think about our lives and as we experience life together, they can kind of lead us away from the way God is going, and we can get caught up in them. That's the individual sin. Now imagine, if you will, that we're walking out towards the tree, and this time the city has come in overnight, and they have, for whatever reason, placed a fire hydrant just on the opposite side of the tree. Not on the sidewalk side, on the opposite side. So now there's a fire hydrant that's permanently installed, and pretend Riley likes fire hydrants like dogs do, and now she wants to constantly go and get herself roped around the tree because she's going toward the fire hydrant. We could look at this example, and we could say that this is the way in which kind of corporate or societal sin plays or wreaks havoc on us. We as a society create these obstacles, these boundaries. We even create temptations within the society that can cause us to veer off the course, to get ourselves wrapped around the tree. If you need an example, think of the I-95 South and all the billboards there. Not all the billboards are that great. Some of the billboards are very bad, actually. They could really get you off of one of those exits and heading into the wrong place. Oh, we've been on 95. Okay, good. We've never gotten off on that exit. That's good. You know what I'm talking about, though, right? These are the ways in which we as a society kind of build sin into the mix. We build these sins and these temptations into the mix, and they create large-scale problems. So there are two kind of solutions that I'm going to throw out there, and then I'm going to backtrack off of them because they're not actually the solutions I like, as you know from hearing me multiple times. The two solutions are this. Let's take the fire hydrant, for instance. I could walk out of the house day after day with Riley and tell Riley, I want you to resist the urge to go to the fire hydrant. I need you to look deep within yourself, maybe see a therapist, about having you kind of come off of that temptation. Just try to suppress the temptation, try to work through that temptation, and don't go to the fire hydrant. And I can put all of the onus for correcting her sinful behavior on her as the individual. We do this a lot. There are some whole churches that preach about that week after week after week, about how you and I have to resist temptation. It is up to us as the individuals to resist the temptation to fall into greed or lust or power or prestige. The other thing you could do is you could say, you know what? That fire hydrant is in the wrong place. It should not be next to that tree. That fire hydrant, whatever city planner, whatever architect decided that there was supposed to be a fire hydrant got it wrong. We need to go and petition the state or the city. We need to go and start a movement, a grassroots movement where we can protest the fire hydrant. And we need to change the structure itself and move the fire hydrant. Take down that billboard off of 95. That is a sinful billboard and it needs to come down. You have whole different churches that are devoted to this type of work, where we are systemically or corporately, communally, looking at the ways that sin kind of wreaks havoc on our lives. And we petition, we work with the civil authorities, we protest, we declare the need for a different future, and we try to fix the system that way. We devote all of our energy to that fix. So you've got the individual, you've got the collective. Those are the two ways you can kind of address the problem of sin. Of course, I'm not actually going to advocate for either of those two ways. It's a both and, but this is not about actually doing that, because the problem with both of those approaches is that we imagine God, like me as walking the dog, to be kind of a sin bean counter. When we just try to reduce our sin count, when we try to just reduce our sin, we imagine God as a bean counter who's sitting up in the sky, looking at us and counting the number of times that we sin. Whether that's individual sin, where we've been tempted to run after a squirrel, or whether that's corporate sin, where we're looking at the fire hydrant that's been installed. God's not a bean counter. God doesn't sit there and kind of hold us on our leash and go, oh, Riley got caught around a tree today and yesterday and the day before, and have some sort of count that then declares how much God loves us. That's not who God is. Instead, I have a different perspective for you. Laying aside the works of darkness and putting on the armor of light is more about walking with God than it is about reducing your sin count. I mean, please reduce your sin count. That's a good thing to do. And by the way, just as a reminder, we're not talking about the big sins here. I don't want any of you to show up in the newspaper. We're not getting on the sheriff's blog or whatever. So none of those big sins. We're really talking about kind of those habituated sins, those small sins. I'm much more concerned, for instance, about a student who has developed a penchant for lying. I'm much more concerned about the student who lies over and over and over again, because that student, in the course of their lives, will get really good at lying. They won't get caught. They'll kind of learn how to game the system with their lies, with their sin, and it will create a habit of sin that will eventually become really, really problematic. I'm much more concerned about that student than a student, for instance, who maybe gets in a fight at school one day. Because I know that student will get caught and will get punished. I know that student will hopefully learn their lesson, maybe deal with their anger or their impulse that led them to that. That's why the church is a church of seasons, like Advent. Because we're a church of habits. We believe that kind of overcoming or working through our sin, casting aside the works of darkness, putting on the armor of light, happens over time. I have 2, 3 ways that we can look at this. First, use love as your guide. Use love as your guide. How do we know what's a sin? Well, Jesus said, love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself, and love yourself. If it doesn't fall into one of those 3 categories, watch out. That's probably not a great place to be. Number 2, follow Jesus. And by this, I actually mean that metaphor with the dog and the owner walking on a leash. We're the dog, and we should really be following Jesus. We should not be leading the way. We should not be out there 30 feet away from Jesus on the leash. But that means putting ourselves second. It means letting our ego take a back seat. It means letting go of some of those desires or some of those ambitions that we might have, and allowing Jesus to lead the way. But third and finally, I want to make a note about thinking too individualistically about sin and overcoming it. Sin is not just about the individual, and the same is true with putting on the armor of light. You don't just put it on by yourself. I have said this before, but I don't think that the person who is stranded on an island with a Bible, the Tom Hanks in Castaway, Tom Hanks in Castaway is not better off as a Christian than we are in this room. And that's because community matters. The church matters. We need to surround ourselves with other like-minded individuals who are on the same path. Why? Well, because we can't always tell where Jesus is going. We can't always hear the voice of God. But if we're walking as a pack of dogs instead of an individual dog, we can at least look over at our neighbor and orient ourselves so that we're heading in the right direction. We can at least share the burden with our neighbor so that we are able to lay aside those works of darkness, put on that armor of light. We can even ask our neighbor, do you think that's what love looks like? Love is a guide, following Jesus, surrounding ourselves with community. And the goal here is not to reduce our sin count, but to walk humbly with God. Walk humbly with God. It's about the relationship we have with God. Sin gets in the way of relationships. That's why to overcome sin, we need to put the relationship first. I experienced this with Riley on my walks. After 4 or 5 days, she knew. She knew how to avoid the tree. She knew kind of what route I like to take. She knew the times when we needed to walk faster because it was next to a busy road. And she knew the times we could kind of slow down because it was a peaceful sidewalk without a lot of traffic. Over time, we will learn by experience, by walking together, by love, to be with God, to walk with God, to learn how that love kind of works in our life. And ultimately, we will learn and experience that forgiveness in a new way that allows us to walk with our Master, walk with Jesus. May we, through this Advent, walk with God, casting aside the works of darkness and putting on the armor of light. Amen.